Chapter 1. Before Yorkshire was Yorkshire. Long before Yorkshire became a name, before counties and kingdoms carved up the land, before castles and cathedrals rose on its soil, the place we know as Yorkshire was already ancient. Its story began not with kings and battles, but with ice, stone, and the slow unfolding of nature. To understand Yorkshire, one must first strip away the familiar trappings of history and imagine a landscape utterly alien, where the cold breath of glaciers shaped valleys and cliffs, and where the first humans left their fleeting marks on stone. During the last ice age, vast sheets of ice crept down from the north, pressing against what would one day be Yorkshire's rolling hills and moors. The ice ground the rocks, carved the valleys, and when it retreated, it left behind a land of contrasts, rugged limestone gorges, fertile plains, sweeping moorlands, and winding rivers that glittered in the pale sun. The Yorkshire we know today, with its dales and peaks and windswept coasts, is the child of that glacial drama. Even in its earliest days, the land was already powerful, demanding respect from those who dared to call it home. It was here, tens of thousands of years ago, that humans left their first traces. In the limestone gorge of Creswell Crags, straddling the border of modern Yorkshire and Derbyshire, people sheltered from the bitter winds in caves that still bear their art. The walls hold engravings of bison, deer, and birds etched by hands long vanished. These are not random scratches. They are the oldest known cave art in Britain, dating back more than 12,000 years. Imagine the flicker of a fire inside the cave, shadows dancing on the rock, while a hunter used a shard of flint to carve the form of an animal that carried both spiritual meaning and practical importance. Those drawings were more than pictures. They were connections to a world where survival depended on understanding the beasts that roamed the land. The fact that they endure at all is a kind of miracle, a whisper from the depths of time that the first Yorkshire folk saw themselves as part of a larger, mysterious order. The Ice Age slowly gave way to warmer times, and the hunters who had roamed with herds of reindeer and mammoth turned to new rhythms. As forests spread across the land, filled with oak and birch, they followed red deer and wild boar. The rivers were alive with fish, the skies with birds, and the people adapted as they always had, crafting tools from flint, bone, and antler. They were few in number, scattered bands who left behind traces so faint that archaeologists sometimes pieced together entire lives from a broken spearhead or a shard of pottery. Yet in these fragments we see how people adjusted to Yorkshire's ever-changing landscapes. The dales offered shelter, the moors a place for hunting, and the coast a highway of sorts where shellfish and seabirds fed those who lingered by the sea. By around 4000 BC, change swept across the land in a form as profound as any battle yet to come. Farming arrived. The people of Yorkshire were no longer simply hunters and gatherers. They became the first farmers, shaping the land not only with their footsteps but with their ploughs. It was a revolution that echoed in every corner of the county. Fields were cleared, forests cut back, and animals domesticated. Wheat and barley took root in soils that had once carried only wild grasses. The transformation was slow, uneven, and not without resistance, but it marked a turning point. The land was no longer simply endured, it was claimed. Evidence of this early farming life can be seen in the great stone monuments that still rise from the moors and hilltops. Mysterious standing stones, circles, and burial mounds dot Yorkshire's landscape, silent witnesses to rituals we can only guess at. Sites like the Thornborough Henges in North Yorkshire, sometimes called the Stonehenge of the North, suggest that the people of this land were not only farmers but also builders of sacred spaces. 3 great henges, vast circular earthworks aligned with the stars, testify to a society that saw the heavens mirrored in the soil beneath their feet. To stand among those ancient banks is to feel the weight of time and the persistence of questions. Why here? Why then? What did they see in the skies that demanded such labor? No written word remains, but the stones themselves speak in their own way. Across the moors, other stones stand lonely and defiant, some as solitary sentinels, others gathered into circles whose purposes blend myth and mystery. Were they calendars guiding the seasons of planting and harvest? Were they gathering places for communities spread thin across the hills? Or were they shrines, places where life and death met under the watchful gaze of ancestors? The truth is lost to us, but their presence is undeniable. Even today, walkers who stumble upon a weathered stone rising from the heather feel something stir, an echo of a time when the landscape itself was alive with meaning. The burial mounds, too, tell a story. Long barrows and cairns were raised over the dead, not to hide them, but to mark them. The ancestors were not gone, they were present, guardians of the land their descendants continued to till. To farm the soil, to plant seed and harvest grain, was to stand in a line stretching back generations with the spirits of the departed bound into the very earth. The people of prehistoric Yorkshire lived close to death, but they also lived close to continuity. The land was not only a resource, it was sacred, its fertility intertwined with human survival. Life, of course, was never easy. The moors were harsh, the winters unforgiving, and the soil often poor. To survive meant constant negotiation with the land, draining, clearing, coaxing it to yield. Communities formed not merely from kinship, but from necessity, sharing labor, pooling resources, and celebrating the cycles of nature together. Festivals of fire and feasting would have marked the solstices, the rising and setting of the sun, a signal as important as any clock. In those gatherings one can imagine stories being told, of spirits in the rocks, of gods in the sky, of ancestors watching from beneath the mounds. Yorkshire's first farmers were also Yorkshire's first storytellers, weaving meaning into a world that could be as cruel as it was generous. The archaeology of these times gives us glimpses of their ingenuity. Stone axes, polished to a shine, were not only tools but also symbols of status, traded across long distances. Pottery, decorated with simple patterns, carried food and drink that bound communities together. Flint from distant quarries turns up in Yorkshire sites, proof that networks of trade and exchange stretched further than one might expect. Even in these early millennia, Yorkshire was not isolated. It was part of a web that connected people across Britain and beyond, bound not by kings or borders, but by the shared human desire to survive and to mark meaning in the world. As the centuries passed, the rhythms of farming settled into tradition. Generations worked the same soil, raised the same crops, and honored the same stones. Yet the land never ceased to shape them. Yorkshire is a county of contrasts, fertile river valleys alongside brooding moors, soft rolling hills giving way to dramatic cliffs. To live here was to live with constant adaptation. Those who dwelled in the Vale of York knew different challenges from those who scraped a living on the Pennine edges, yet all were bound by the same truth. The land demanded resilience. It rewarded those who respected it and punished those who did not. By the time the Bronze Age dawned, long before Rome or Vikings or Norman kings, the identity of this land was already taking shape. It was not yet called Yorkshire, but it was already a place where people carved out lives from stone and soil, where they looked to the skies for guidance and to the earth for sustenance. The monuments they left behind, caves etched with animals, circles aligned with stars, mounds raised for the dead, stand as Yorkshire's first history book, written not in ink, but in rock and earth. When we look back across these thousands of years, it is tempting to see only shadows, the faint scratches of art, the weathered stones, the ghostly outlines of settlements. Yet there is a deeper truth beneath the fragments. The people who walked these lands long before the word Yorkshire existed were not so different from us. They loved, feared, dreamed, and sought meaning in a world often beyond their control. They carried children, buried their dead, and told stories around fires that flickered against the cave walls of Creswell Crags. Their world was harsher, but their humanity was the same. And so when we speak of Yorkshire's history, we must begin not with kings and queens, but with these nameless ancestors. They remind us that history is not only about rulers and battles, but also about survival, adaptation, and the unyielding bond between people and place. The land itself was Yorkshire's first ruler, and its subjects carved their lives in accordance with its demands. Everything that came later, the rise of kingdoms, the clash of armies, the building of cathedrals, was shaped upon this ancient foundation. The story of Yorkshire then begins not with power or conquest, but with ice and stone, with hunters and farmers, with mysteries still standing silent on the moors. And from here, from this deep beginning, the tale will move forward to new arrivals, new faiths, and new struggles that would forever change the destiny of this land. Chapter 2. The Romans in Eboracum. From the moment the first farmers carved the soil and the great stones rose on the moors, Yorkshire had been a land shaped by resilience. Yet nothing prepared it for the arrival of Rome, that vast machine of empire which stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. Where there had once been scattered tribes and sacred landscapes, the Roman eagle brought order, power, and ambition. And in the heart of Yorkshire, on the banks of the River Ouse, a city was born that would play a role far greater than anyone could have imagined: Eboracum, later York. When the legions first pushed into Britain in the 1st century AD, they came to a land divided among tribes who had long histories of rivalry and alliance. Yorkshire was the territory of the Brigantes, the largest tribe in Britain, whose influence extended across the Pennines. To the Romans, who valued submission and feared rebellion, the Brigantes were a people to watch closely. At first, Rome struck alliances, installing Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, as a client ruler. She famously handed over the rebel Caratacus to the Romans, earning their gratitude but stirring unrest among her own people. Factional strife followed, and soon the legions were marching north in force, determined that this borderland would not defy them. Around AD 71, the Roman governor Quintus Petilius Cerialis led campaigns against the Brigantes and their allies. To secure the north, he ordered the construction of a fortress at a strategic crossing of the River Ouse. The site was carefully chosen. Rivers provided transport, fertile land stretched nearby, and from here the legions could strike west toward the Pennines or north toward the untamed lands of the Picts. Thus Eboracum was founded, its name perhaps derived from a pre-Roman word for place of the yew trees. What began as a military installation would become one of the most important cities in Roman Britain. Imagine the first days: soldiers setting up timber palisades, digging ditches, erecting barracks, granaries, and headquarters. The scent of fresh-cut wood, the clang of iron, and the endless rhythm of hammers turned wilderness into a bastion of Roman power. The 9th Legion, Legio Nona Hispana, took up residence. Their standards gleamed with gold, their discipline was legendary, and their presence declared that Rome had come to stay. For the local tribes, the fortress was both a threat and a promise. Trade flowed quickly to the garrison, for soldiers needed food, leather, cloth, and entertainment. Where the legions camped, towns soon grew, and Eboracum was no exception. Over time, timber gave way to stone. By the 2nd century, massive stone walls enclosed the fortress, gates rose at its entrances, and towers looked out over the surrounding countryside. The Roman grid of streets cut sharply through the settlement, an order imposed upon the land. Civilian settlements sprang up outside the walls, full of traders, craftsmen, and families who followed the legions. Taverns bustled, bathhouses steamed, and temples echoed with prayers to gods both Roman and local. For Rome was not only conqueror, it was also an absorber of cultures. Celtic deities merged with Roman ones, and altars discovered in York bear witness to a mingling of traditions. One can almost hear the chatter of Latin mixing with the native tongue in the market stalls as merchants sold pottery, glassware, and salted fish to soldiers eager to spend their pay. Eboracum's importance grew as the frontier shifted. The building of Hadrian's Wall in the early 2nd century made Yorkshire a staging ground for operations in the north. Later, when Antonine ambitions pushed into Scotland, Eboracum again served as a supply hub. Its roads linked it to other fortresses and ports, tying Yorkshire firmly into the imperial web. To march along those straight Roman roads was to walk upon the veins of empire, carrying goods, soldiers, and ideas. It was not only logistics that set Eboracum apart, but politics. The city became the seat of Roman governors and a residence for emperors themselves when they came to Britain to lead campaigns. Around AD 208, the Emperor Septimius Severus arrived in Eboracum with his family and court. From here, he directed operations against the tribes beyond Hadrian's Wall, hoping to subdue the north once and for all. For several years, York was effectively the capital of the empire's northern frontier. Severus was a hardened ruler, but even he could not conquer death. In AD 211, he died in Eboracum, his body later taken to Rome. To think of an emperor of Rome breathing his last in Yorkshire is to realize how far the reach of this land extended into the wider story of the world. The city's moment of greatest fame came a century later. In AD 306, another emperor was in York, Constantius Chlorus, who had been campaigning in the north. Like Severus before him, he fell ill and died in Eboracum. But his son Constantine was present, and the legions there acclaimed him emperor. That young man would become Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor of Rome, the founder of Constantinople, and one of the most influential rulers in history. The proclamation in Eboracum sent ripples across the empire, changing the destiny of Europe. From a fortress on the edge of Britain, the course of Rome itself was altered. One can picture the moment, the gathered legions in their armor, the standards fluttering, the voices rising in acclamation as Constantine was lifted onto a shield or platform, declared ruler by soldiers loyal to his cause. In that instant, Yorkshire touched eternity. The daily life of Eboracum, however, was not only about emperors and armies. It was about the blend of cultures that made the city vibrant. Archaeological finds show villas with mosaic floors, evidence of wealth and comfort. Inscriptions reveal dedications to gods, both Roman, like Jupiter and Mithras, and Celtic, like the goddess Brigantia, whose very name echoed the local tribe subdued centuries before. Merchants brought goods from across the empire, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, fine pottery from the Mediterranean. To walk the streets of Eboracum was to walk in a miniature Rome, a cosmopolitan centre where Yorkshire's position as frontier became an asset rather than a burden. Yet beneath the surface, the presence of Rome was always contested. The Brigantes had been broken, but not erased. Rebellions flared, requiring harsh suppression. The legions stationed in Eboracum were not ornamental, they were necessary. To the north lay lands that never truly submitted, lands the Romans could never fully tame. Yorkshire was the buffer, the hinge between the civilized south and the wild north. Soldiers drilled daily, walls were repaired, and watchtowers scanned the horizons because peace here was fragile, bought with vigilance. The economy of Roman Yorkshire thrived because of this military presence. Farms supplied grain and livestock, mines provided lead, and craftsmen made everything from shoes to weapons. The Ouse and Humber rivers carried goods to the sea, linking the city to trade routes across the empire. It was a frontier, but a prosperous one, and for centuries Eboracum held its place as one of the great cities of Britain, rivaled only by Londinium in importance. Still, time erodes even the strongest walls. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the empire itself was straining. Invasions, usurpations, and crises rippled across its vast territories. Eboracum remained important, but its glory dimmed as Rome's grip weakened. The city saw emperors come and go, officials replaced, troops redeployed. The legions that once marched with such confidence now fought to hold back tides of change. Constantine had risen here, but centuries later his successors struggled to keep Britain secure. When the empire finally pulled its forces from the island in the early 5th century, Eboracum was left behind, a Roman city stranded without Rome. The stones endured, the walls, the roads, the fragments of mosaics and altars, all of these whispered of a time when Yorkshire was a northern capital of empire. For centuries afterward, people would wander among the ruins, reusing the stones to build new homes, repurposing what Rome had left behind. The name changed, the power faded, but the memory remained. Even in the Middle Ages, legends circulated of the grandeur of York in Roman times, when emperors had lived and died within its walls. To tell the story of Yorkshire is to understand this duality, a land both remote and central, both provincial and world-shaping. The founding of Eboracum was not simply a local event, it was a moment when Yorkshire stepped onto the stage of global history. The cave art of Creswell Crags had spoken of survival and spirit. The standing stones of the moors had reached toward the heavens. Now, in the heart of the county, stone walls and marching legions proclaimed that Yorkshire was part of something larger still, the Roman dream of order that stretched from the Tiber to the Ouse. The story will move on, new powers will rise, old ones will fall. But the shadow of Rome lingered long after the legions departed, its roads still threading the countryside, its walls still marking the shape of York. And in the tale of emperors who died here and one who rose to greatness, Yorkshire had left its mark on the very destiny of Europe. Chapter 3. Angles, Saxons and the Kingdom of Northumbria. When the legions finally marched away from Eboracum, leaving their fortress and their city behind, they left a silence that was far more dangerous than the clash of arms. For centuries, Rome had been the shield that protected Britain from the storms beyond the wall. Its soldiers had kept the tribes of the north at bay, its roads had bound the land together, and its officials had maintained a kind of order that seemed permanent. But Rome itself was faltering, and when its armies were withdrawn, Britain became vulnerable. The abandoned walls of Eboracum and the deserted forts along the roads stood as monuments to an empire that was gone, but the land they left behind was not empty. It was waiting, and others were watching. Into this vacuum came new peoples, carried by the tides of migration that swept across Europe in the early centuries of the first millennium. Among them were the Angles and the Saxons, tribes from across the North Sea. Their homelands in what is now Germany and Denmark were crowded, their fields often poor, and their eyes turned westward to the fertile, undefended shores of Britain. At first they came as mercenaries, invited by desperate local leaders who sought strong arms to defend against raiders. But mercenaries soon became settlers. The Angles and Saxons saw not only pay, but opportunity. And once they had established themselves, they began to carve out new territories, pushing aside the native Britons and reshaping the landscape of power. In Yorkshire, the transformation was gradual but relentless. The old Roman city of Eboracum lingered on, but its grandeur faded. Without the legions to support it, Roman institutions collapsed. Villas fell into disrepair, trade dwindled, and the stone walls were stripped for new building. The countryside returned to a harsher, simpler life. But amid this decline, the newcomers began to impose their own identity. They brought their language, which would eventually evolve into English. They brought their pagan gods, Woden, Thunor, Tiw, whose echoes can still be heard in the names of days and places. And they brought a fierce sense of kinship and loyalty that allowed them to forge kingdoms from chaos. By the 6th century, the Angles had become the dominant force in northern England, and their settlements spread across the valleys and hills of Yorkshire. Fields were ploughed once again, villages grew where Roman towns had withered, and new power centres emerged. Out of this patchwork of tribes and territories, a greater kingdom began to form, Northumbria. Its name meant the land north of the Humber, and it encompassed not only Yorkshire but vast stretches of the north from coast to coast. What had once been a frontier of Rome was now the heart of a new power, one that would shine brighter than any other in early medieval England. Northumbria's story is one of both blood and brilliance. Its kings rose through conquest, uniting smaller realms by the sword. Its warriors fought as fiercely as any in Britain, their reputation spreading across seas. Yet it was also a kingdom of culture, of faith, and of learning, and in this dual nature it carved its place in history. At its height, Northumbria was the centre of England's first great golden age, and much of that glory began in Yorkshire. The conversion of the Angles to Christianity marked a turning point. Their gods of thunder and war had suited a time of conquest, but as Northumbria grew, it sought new forms of legitimacy. In 627, King Edwin of Northumbria was baptized in York, within the ruins of what had once been the Roman city. A small wooden church was built for the occasion, the first Christian church in York, where centuries later York Minster would rise in stone. The symbolism was powerful. The old Roman Eboracum, once the city of emperors, now became the seat of a Christian king. From that moment, the faith spread across the land, carried by missionaries and monks who brought with them not only religion but also learning, literacy and art. Nowhere did this spirit flourish more than on the island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast. Though outside Yorkshire itself, its influence reached deep into the county, for the monks who lived and prayed there became the teachers, scribes and missionaries who shaped Northumbrian identity. Founded by Aidan, an Irish monk invited by King Oswald, Lindisfarne became a beacon of faith. From its shores came a stream of holy men who walked barefoot through villages, speaking simply and living humbly, winning converts not by force but by example. Their mission reached every corner of Northumbria, binding its people not only to their kings but to a higher shared faith. It was within this flowering of Christian culture that one of Yorkshire's most remarkable figures was born, Bede. Living at the monastery of Jarrow, just beyond Yorkshire's borders, Bede spent his life studying, teaching and writing. His works included biblical commentaries, scientific observations and poetry, but his greatest gift to history was his ecclesiastical history of the English people. In it, he told the story of how the English were converted, how kingdoms rose and fell, and how God's plan unfolded in the lives of kings and monks alike. Without Bede, much of what we know of early England would be lost. He was called the father of English history, and rightly so, for he gave his people a memory, a sense of themselves as part of a larger whole. Though he lived north of Yorkshire, his world was inseparable from it, and his vision made Northumbria the intellectual heart of Europe for a time. The monasteries of Northumbria, many in or near Yorkshire, became centres not only of prayer but of artistry. Monks illuminated manuscripts with breathtaking beauty, their pages alive with intricate designs that blended Celtic, Germanic and Christian motifs. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created in this period, remain one of the most dazzling treasures of medieval art, their colours and patterns a testament to a culture that combined warrior strength with delicate devotion. These works were not merely decorative, they were acts of faith, offerings of time and skill meant to glorify God. And they were made in the north, in lands once thought barbarous and remote, proving that Yorkshire and its neighbours could rival Rome itself in brilliance. But the splendour of Northumbria was built on fragile foundations. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed, their thrones won and lost in battles that stained the fields of Yorkshire with blood. The kingdom's power reached its height under rulers like Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu, who expanded its influence across much of England and even into Scotland. For a moment, it seemed as if Northumbria might dominate the whole island, yet ambition bred conflict, and rival kingdoms struck back. Mercia to the south became Northumbria's great foe, and the struggle between the two would shape centuries of English history. For Yorkshire, this meant both glory and grief, as its people were drawn into wars that burned villages, ravaged fields, and tested loyalties. Still, even in war, the cultural flame burned. Monasteries rebuilt after raids, manuscripts continued to be copied, and the memory of saints inspired devotion. Figures like Cuthbert, Bishop of Lindisfarne, became legends, revered not only for miracles but for their humility and faith. Pilgrims flocked to their shrines, and Yorkshire's roads became pathways not only for armies but for worshippers seeking healing and hope. This blending of the martial and the spiritual was the essence of Northumbria, a kingdom of swords and scriptures, of kings and monks, of war and wonder. By the 8th century, Northumbria was renowned across Europe. Scholars from the continent came to learn from its monks, manuscripts travelled far beyond its borders, and its kings corresponded with rulers in distant lands. In an age often called dark, Northumbria shone with light, and at its heart was Yorkshire, whose valleys and coasts provided both the resources and the inspiration for this flowering of culture. From York's growing importance as a religious centre to the quiet labour of scribes in remote monasteries, Yorkshire was inseparable from Northumbria's rise. Yet beneath the glory, shadows gathered. The kingdom's internal strife weakened it, and its very success made it a target for envious rivals. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now what matters is the vision. Yorkshire transformed from a land abandoned by Rome into the beating heart of a new power, a kingdom forged by Angles and Saxons that gave birth to saints, scholars, and a culture of learning unmatched in its time. The names of its kings may fade, but the legacy of Bede, of Lindisfarne's monks, and of the first English history endures. And so Yorkshire, once the frontier of an empire, became the cradle of a kingdom, a place where pagan gods yielded to the cross, where warriors and monks shared the same soil, and where England's story as a people truly began. Chapter 4. The Viking Invasion. The kingdom of Northumbria had reached dazzling heights, a land of saints and scholars, of kings who dreamed of ruling all England, and of monks who preserved the light of learning in a troubled world. Yet greatness, as history often teaches, attracts danger. While Northumbria fought its rivals and nurtured its culture, new storms gathered across the North Sea. From the fjords and islands of Scandinavia came the Vikings, warriors and traders, raiders and settlers, whose sails struck terror into the hearts of Europe. Yorkshire, proud and rich, lay directly in their path. The days of Northumbria's dominance were numbered, for the age of Jorvik was about to begin. The first Viking raids on Britain were sudden and shocking. Monasteries on the coast, wealthy but poorly defended, became the earliest victims. In 793, Lindisfarne was attacked, its monks slaughtered or scattered, its treasures carried off across the sea. News of the desecration spread quickly, and the name Viking became synonymous with horror. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle spoke of fiery dragons seen in the sky, omens of the destruction to come. Yorkshire's coasts and rivers, with their easy access to the heartland, made it especially vulnerable. Ships glided up the Humber and Ouse, striking settlements and vanishing before defenders could respond. At first, the raids were hit and run, brief flashes of violence, but soon the Vikings came not only to plunder, but to conquer. In 865, a vast force arrived that changed everything. Known to history as the Great Heathen Army, it was said to be led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Norse hero. Ragnar's fate, whether myth or truth, was said to have been sealed in Northumbria itself, where he was captured by King Ella and thrown into a pit of snakes. His sons swore vengeance, and their vengeance came on a scale the Anglo-Saxons could scarcely imagine. The Great Heathen Army was no mere raiding band. It was an invasion force, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors, men who came not just to steal, but to seize land, to build kingdoms of their own. The shock of their arrival was immense. Northumbria, weakened by internal strife and rival claimants to its throne, could not withstand the onslaught. In 867, the Vikings marched on York. The city, once Eboracum and now the heart of Northumbria, fell to them after bitter fighting. King Ella was captured, and legend tells that he met his end through the dreaded Blood Eagle, though whether this grim tale is truth or saga invention we cannot know. What is certain is that the capture of York marked the end of Northumbria's independence and the birth of a new era. The Vikings had come to stay, and they made the city their own. They called it Jorvik. Under their rule, York was transformed. Far from being a ruined conquest, it became a bustling, thriving centre of commerce and culture. The Vikings were raiders, yes, but they were also traders, and they saw in Yorkshire an opportunity. Its rivers linked it to the sea, its fertile lands offered wealth, and its location allowed connections deep into the interior of England. Markets sprang up in Jorvik, where goods from across the known world were exchanged. Amber from the Baltic, silver from the Middle East, furs, weapons, and slaves all passed through its streets. Excavations in modern York have uncovered evidence of this vibrancy. Coins minted under Viking kings, weights and measures used in trade, tools from workshops that produced combs, jewellery, and fine metalwork. Jorvik was no longer simply a captured city. It was a hub of the Viking world. The people who lived there reflected this transformation. Norse settlers intermingled with the local Anglo-Saxon population, their languages blending into a dialect that still shapes Yorkshire speech today. Words of Norse origin entered the vocabulary: beck for a stream, gill for a narrow valley, thwaite for a clearing, kirk for a church. Even the names of towns and villages bear the imprint of the Norse, places ending in -by, -thorpe, -thwaite, and -toft stand as silent memorials to Viking settlers. Yorkshire's very map is a palimpsest of this Norse presence, etched into the land itself. Religion, too, reflected this mingling. The Vikings came as pagans, worshippers of Odin, Thor, and Freyja. They raised runestones and performed rites to their gods, yet over time, many converted to Christianity, blending the old with the new. Crosses carved in stone survive from this era, adorned not only with Christian symbols but with serpents and dragons from Norse mythology. These hybrid monuments speak of a society that did not erase but combined, where cultures collided and then coexisted. Yorkshire became a place of fusion, its identity reshaped by the Norse presence. The rule of Jorvik was not uncontested. Viking kings rose and fell with dizzying speed, and the wider struggle for England raged around them. The Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great and his successors, fought to contain and eventually absorb the Danelaw, the vast region of England under Danish control, of which Yorkshire was a core part. But for nearly a century, Jorvik remained a stronghold of Viking power. Kings like Halfdan, Guthfrith, and Eric Bloodaxe held court in York, issuing coins stamped with their names, commanding armies, and negotiating with both allies and enemies. Some were remembered for prosperity, others for violence, but all left their mark on Yorkshire's history. The daily life of the city under the Vikings was as fascinating as its politics. Archaeology paints a vivid picture: timber houses lining narrow streets, hearths where meals were cooked, workshops where craftsmen shaped antler into combs or hammered silver into ornaments. Children played in muddy lanes, merchants haggled over prices, and the smell of smoke and cooking fish drifted over the markets. Jorvik was noisy, crowded, alive. It was not a frontier outpost, but a city at the centre of networks stretching across seas and continents. The Norse were master sailors, and their ships carried Yorkshire into the wider world. The countryside, too, bore their influence. Farms were established, often retaining the old Anglo-Saxon patterns, but infused with new techniques and names. The Norse valued land and livestock as much as silver, and Yorkshire's fertile valleys became the backbone of their wealth. Villages thrived under Norse lords who demanded tribute, but also provided protection. In the dales and on the moors, life went on with rhythms older than the Vikings themselves, yet subtly altered by their presence. The landscape carried new names, new boundaries, new stories. Even today, traces of this world remain. Walk through York, and beneath the modern streets lie layers of Viking occupation preserved in the damp soil. The discoveries at Coppergate in the 20th century revealed an astonishingly detailed view of Jorvik's life, from shoes and tools to latrines and gaming pieces. These fragments remind us that the Vikings were not only warriors, but people with families, pastimes, and ambitions. They laughed, they traded, they worshipped, they quarrelled, much like any other community. To reduce them to raiders alone is to miss the richness of their contribution. Yet it is undeniable that they brought violence too. Battles scarred Yorkshire's fields, and power shifted through bloodshed as often as through trade. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of armies clashing, kings slain, and villages burned. The Vikings were both destroyers and creators, their legacy one of contradiction. But it is precisely this duality that made Jorvik so enduring. It was a city born of conquest, yet it became a place where cultures met and merged, leaving behind a heritage that still shapes Yorkshire's character. By the 10th century, Jorvik's independence waned. The kings of Wessex extended their reach, and the tide of history turned toward the unification of England. In 954, Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king of York, was driven out and killed. With his fall, Jorvik was absorbed into the emerging English kingdom. Yet even as political control shifted, the Norse legacy endured: the language, the place names, the traditions, They had taken root too deeply to vanish. Yorkshire was forever changed, its identity enriched by the centuries of Viking presence. And so from Ragnar's sons to the bustling markets of Jorvik, the story of the Vikings in Yorkshire is one of transformation. What began as vengeance and invasion ended as settlement and integration. The great heathen army shattered Northumbria, but from the ruins rose a city that connected Yorkshire to the world, a place of trade, culture, and enduring influence. To walk the streets of York today is to walk upon that history, to hear in the names of towns and rivers the echoes of Norse tongues, to feel in the very character of Yorkshire the toughness, independence, and adaptability that the Vikings brought. The age of Jorvik ended, but its spirit lingered, and as the centuries moved forward, new powers would arrive, new struggles would unfold, and Yorkshire would once again find itself at the crossroads of history. Chapter 5. Norman Conquest and the Harrying of the North. The fall of Jorvik and the fading of Viking kings did not bring peace to Yorkshire. Instead, it opened the door to new struggles, new rulers, and one of the darkest chapters in the county's long history. For in 1066, the year that changed England forever, Yorkshire once again became a battleground, and the consequences of that year would scar its land and people for generations. The Norman Conquest, with its ruthless suppression and brutal retribution, reshaped Yorkshire in fire and famine, leaving behind both the grandeur of castles and the memory of devastation. It is here, in the story of the harrying of the North, that Yorkshire learned both the weight of conquest and the endurance of survival. The year began with uncertainty. England was a kingdom divided by claims and ambitions. When King Edward the Confessor died childless, rivals vied for the throne. Harold Godwinson of Wessex, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. Yorkshire found itself in the path of these ambitions. In September of 1066, Harold Hardrada, the great Norwegian warrior king, sailed with a vast fleet and landed in the north. He was joined by Tostig, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother, who sought vengeance against his own kin. Their army marched into Yorkshire, and at Fulford, just outside York, they met the forces of the northern earls. The battle was ferocious, fought in marshy ground by the River Ouse. The English were overwhelmed, and York prepared to submit. For a moment it seemed as if Viking rule might return, a last echo of Jorvik rising from the past, but fate shifted with astonishing speed. Harold Godwinson, newly crowned king, marched his army north at a pace that stunned both friend and foe. At Stamford Bridge, east of York, he caught the Norwegians unprepared. The battle that followed was legendary. The Norse fought bravely, but they were exhausted and outnumbered. Harold Hardrada, called the Thunderbolt of the North, was struck down by an arrow, and Tostig fell beside him. So complete was the English victory that only a fraction of the Viking fleet returned across the sea. The age of the great Viking invasions was ended, and Yorkshire had witnessed its final stand. Yet even in triumph, doom approached. For while Harold fought in the north, William of Normandy landed in the south. The victory at Stamford Bridge left the English weary and weakened, and 3 weeks later at Hastings, Harold was slain. William the Conqueror claimed the throne, and a new, harsher chapter opened. At first, the North held back. Yorkshire and its people had long been proud of their independence, their loyalties shifting only under duress. The Normans, though victorious in the south, were strangers here, and their rule was resented. William marched north to enforce his authority, building castles as he went, each one a stone fist clenched over the land. York, the great city, became his target, for whoever controlled York controlled the north. In 1068, William's forces entered the city, and 2 castles were built to dominate it, their timber towers rising over the streets as symbols of Norman power. The message was clear: rebellion would not be tolerated, but rebellion came nonetheless. The north would not yield easily, and in 1069 resistance flared again. The people of Yorkshire rose in anger, joined by allies from Scotland and a fleet sent by the King of Denmark. York was attacked, its Norman garrison overwhelmed, and the castles set ablaze. The rebels had struck at the very heart of Norman control, and William's fury was terrible to behold. He marched north with relentless determination, retook York, and slaughtered its defenders. Yet still the rebellion smouldered. The people of Yorkshire, hardened by centuries of invasions, refused to bow. It was then that William unleashed one of the most devastating campaigns in English history, the harrying of the North. The harrying was not war in the usual sense, it was annihilation. William's orders were clear: to crush resistance by destroying not only armies, but the very means of survival. Villages were burned, fields stripped, livestock slaughtered, and stores of grain destroyed. Entire swathes of Yorkshire were reduced to ash. The people who survived the sword faced famine, and famine claimed more lives than battle ever had. Chroniclers of the times spoke with horror of corpses lining the roads, of families driven to eat roots, dogs, even human flesh to survive. The land that had once fed armies and sustained kingdoms was turned into a wasteland. For generations afterward, the scars remained. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, recorded vast areas of Yorkshire as waste, incapable of yielding tax or produce. It was the written echo of a devastation so complete that it haunted memory long after. The human cost was immense. Tens of thousands perished, and whole communities vanished. The thriving culture that had made Yorkshire the heart of Northumbria was silenced. Where once monasteries had copied manuscripts and markets had bustled, there was emptiness. The harrying was an act of terror, a deliberate reminder that William's rule was absolute and defiance would be crushed without mercy. If ever Yorkshire had doubted the price of resistance, it learned it then in fire and starvation. Yet out of this darkness, new structures arose, both literal and symbolic. William's castles multiplied. Their stone keeps replacing the burned timbers of earlier fortresses. Clifford's Tower in York, rising on its mound, became the most famous of these symbols of domination. From its heights, Normans could look down on a subdued city, its people living under watchful eyes. Castles were not only military strongholds, they were statements of power, permanent marks of conquest carved into the landscape. Across Yorkshire, similar fortifications appeared, each one a reminder of the new order. The people who had once looked to their lords for protection now lived in the shadow of foreign rulers, their authority enforced by walls of stone. The Normans also reshaped the land through feudalism, a system that bound people to their lords in new ways. William granted vast estates to his Norman followers, men who had fought beside him at Hastings. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility of Yorkshire was swept aside, their land seized and redistributed. To the people of Yorkshire, this meant not only new rulers but a new hierarchy, one in which loyalty was demanded and freedom diminished. The Norman barons built their halls and churches, imposing their culture and language. For centuries, Yorkshire's lords would speak French, while its peasants tilled the soil in silence. The conquest was not just military, it was social, cultural, and psychological. Still, the people endured. Yorkshire had been devastated, but it was not destroyed. Slowly, painfully, fields were cleared again, villages rebuilt, and life returned to the valleys and dales. The castles that had symbolized oppression gradually became part of the landscape, their presence accepted as both threat and protection. New churches were raised, blending Norman stonework with local traditions. And though the scars of the harrying remained, Yorkshire's resilience shone through. The land that had been turned to waste would once again feed its people, and the spirit of defiance, though subdued, would never entirely die. The harrying of the North remains one of the most infamous episodes in English history. To some it was a necessary act to secure the kingdom, a ruthless but effective assertion of Norman power. To others, it was a crime against humanity, an atrocity that stands as a warning across time. For Yorkshire, it was both, a moment of profound suffering and a turning point that reshaped its destiny. The castles, the feudal system, the new rulers, all of these were born from that crucible of fire and famine. And even as centuries passed, the memory lingered, carried in stories, in ruins, in the silence of villages that never rose again. The Norman conquest did not erase Yorkshire's identity, but it forced it to adapt. The people who had survived Viking raids, who had endured the rise and fall of Northumbria, now lived under Norman rule. Yet their resilience was unbroken. From the ashes of the harrying, Yorkshire would rebuild, and in time it would play its part in shaping the medieval kingdom that emerged. But it would never forget the price of conquest, nor the terrible lesson William had taught, that power could devastate, but it could not erase the stubborn endurance of a land and its people. The story of Yorkshire, then, is not only one of suffering, but of survival. The Norman conquest brought castles and cruelty, famine and fear, but it also set the stage for the county's next chapter. For from the ruins new institutions would rise, new conflicts would emerge, and Yorkshire's role in the medieval world would grow. The harrying was a scar, but it was also a reminder that Yorkshire, though wounded, could not be silenced. Its land, its people, its spirit endured, and endured still. Chapter 6. Medieval Yorkshire. The smoke of the harrying eventually cleared, but its scars remained long after William the Conqueror had imposed his will upon the north. Yorkshire, though wounded, was not destroyed. It began slowly to recover, its villages rebuilt, its fields sown again, its people adapting to the new Norman order. Over time, the devastation gave way to renewal, and the Middle Ages in Yorkshire would prove to be a period of both profound faith and violent conflict. Out of its ruins rose cathedrals and monasteries of breathtaking beauty, castles that anchored power, and battles so bloody they seared themselves into the national memory. Yorkshire's medieval story is one of contrasts, devotion and bloodshed, glory and ruin, all playing out upon the same resilient soil. The Normans, having broken the north with fire, sought to remake it with stone. Castles multiplied, not merely as military bastions, but as instruments of administration and symbols of Norman authority. York's Clifford's Tower, rebuilt in stone after an early timber keep burned, became a commanding presence over the city. Across the county, fortresses like Pontefract, Richmond, and Skipton rose, their massive walls declaring to all who saw them that a new age had arrived. These castles were not simply homes for lords, they were centres of control. Within their walls taxes were collected, justice was meted out, and armies were mustered. To live in medieval Yorkshire was to live in the shadow of stone, reminded daily that power now resided in fortresses built by conquerors. Yet alongside this martial architecture, another kind of building flourished, the houses of God. Nowhere is this more powerfully expressed than in the rise of York Minster. The small wooden church erected for King Edwin's baptism centuries earlier had long since been replaced, but the Normans envisioned something grander still. In the 12th and 13th centuries, work began on the minster we know today, a cathedral of astonishing scale and beauty. Stone by stone, generation after generation, craftsmen raised walls and towers, carved intricate tracery, and filled windows with glass that caught the northern light. To enter the minster even now is to feel the ambition of that medieval faith, a building not only for worship, but as a statement that Yorkshire too was part of Christendom's grandeur. York became the seat of an archbishop, rival to Canterbury, its clergy wielding immense influence both spiritual and political. The minster dominated the city as completely as any castle, though its power was claimed in the name of God. Beyond York, monasteries spread across Yorkshire's valleys and hills, their presence shaping both landscape and society. The Cistercians, seeking places of solitude, founded houses in remote settings that became centres of industry and devotion alike. Fountains Abbey, established in 1132, grew into one of the greatest monastic complexes in Europe. Its soaring ruins today still hint at the scale of its ambition. Vast cloisters, grand refectories, and intricate stonework that spoke of both piety and prosperity. The monks who lived there followed strict rules of prayer and labour, rising before dawn to chant the offices, then working the land, tending sheep, brewing ale, and copying manuscripts. Their abbey became a hub of economic activity, its estates extending across the county, its wool traded far beyond England. Similarly, Rievaulx Abbey in the North York moors blossomed into a powerful institution, its influence spreading through lands once thought barren and remote. These monasteries, with their rhythms of prayer and work, shaped the very fabric of medieval Yorkshire life. The contrast between castle and cloister defined the age. On the one hand, lords ruling with sword and stone, on the other, monks pursuing salvation through prayer and labour. Yet the two were not as separate as they might seem. Nobles endowed monasteries with land and wealth, hoping to buy favour in heaven. Monasteries in turn provided education, charity, and spiritual legitimacy for the social order. Together they created a society both deeply devout and rigidly hierarchical, bound by loyalty, obligation, and faith. But if religion was a binding force, conflict was never far away. Yorkshire, with its fertile lands and strategic position, became a prize worth fighting for, and the Middle Ages saw it drawn repeatedly into the wars that racked England. Perhaps the most infamous of these was the Battle of Towton, fought on Palm Sunday in 1461 during the Wars of the Roses. The dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York engulfed the realm, and Yorkshire stood at the very heart of the conflict. Towton, fought just outside the city, was a clash of unimaginable ferocity. Chroniclers record that tens of thousands fought that day, and tens of thousands fell. Snow fell thick upon the fields, the wind driving into the faces of the Lancastrians as arrows darkened the sky. The fighting raged for hours, men locked in hand-to-hand combat until exhaustion and blood blurred all distinction. By the day's end, the Yorkist cause had triumphed, and the field was strewn with the dead. It is remembered as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, a grim testament to how dynastic ambition could drown the land in slaughter. Towton was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern. Yorkshire, proud of its name and identity, lent itself to the Yorkist cause, and its people bore the consequences. Towns and villages suffered the passage of armies, fields were trampled, and families were torn by shifting loyalties. Castles that had once been symbols of Norman conquest now became contested prizes in wars between rival English houses. Pontefract Castle, in particular, played a central role in these struggles, its walls besieged and fought over repeatedly. The county, already accustomed to centuries of invasion and repression, now endured civil war among its own. The medieval centuries in Yorkshire were thus marked by paradox. On the one hand, faith reached soaring heights in stone and song. The minster rose toward heaven, monasteries flourished in wealth and devotion, and learning was preserved in cloisters where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. On the other hand, violence never seemed far away. From baronial rebellions to dynastic wars, the soil of Yorkshire drank deeply of blood. Its people lived with both awe and fear, awe at the beauty of their cathedrals, fear at the tramp of armies across their fields. Yet through it all, Yorkshire's resilience endured. The county produced saints and scholars, warriors and kings. Its markets thrived, its wool enriched Europe, its churches inspired devotion, and its castles stood against both rebellion and invasion. Even the devastation of Towton did not silence it. In the aftermath of war, life continued. Ploughs returned to the fields, monks to their prayers, merchants to their stalls. The rhythm of life was bruised but never broken. Looking back across these centuries, it is tempting to see only the contrasts, the lofty towers of York Minster rising above streets where blood had run, the serene cloisters of Fountains Abbey standing in a land often torn by war. But perhaps it is precisely this tension that defines medieval Yorkshire. It was a land of faith and conflict, beauty and brutality, resilience and ruin. Each castle, each abbey, each battlefield told part of the story, and together they created a tapestry as complex and compelling as any woven in its halls. As the Middle Ages drew on, the great monasteries reached their zenith, their wealth and influence stretching across the county. Yet even as they flourished, shadows loomed on the horizon. Change was coming, religious upheaval, new monarchs, new ideas that would shake the foundations of cloister and cathedral alike. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, the story of medieval Yorkshire is the story of a land where stone spoke both of faith and of fear, where devotion built soaring arches and dynastic ambition spilled rivers of blood. It is the story of cathedrals and castles, monks and warriors, saints and soldiers, all bound together in a county that even in its darkest hours refused to be broken. Chapter 7. Tudor and Stuart Yorkshire. The medieval centuries had left Yorkshire with towering monasteries, a majestic cathedral, and scars from battles like Towton that had stained its fields red. By the dawn of the Tudor age, the county stood both proud and weary, deeply bound to the rhythms of the church and the authority of its lords. Yet as England shifted under the ambitions of new monarchs, Yorkshire once again found itself at the heart of upheaval. Faith, loyalty, and survival were tested as Henry VIII tore down the monastic world, and as later generations fought each other in a bitter civil war, Yorkshire became a stage for rebellion, loyalty, and betrayal. This was a time when old certainties dissolved, when allegiance could mean life or death, and when the county's people bore witness to both destruction and transformation. The monasteries had long been Yorkshire's pride. Fountains, Rievaulx, Byland, and countless others dotted the landscape, their towers rising from valleys, their bells marking the hours of prayer. They were not simply religious houses, they were centres of learning, farming, and charity, woven deeply into the fabric of daily life. The wool from their flocks fueled trade across Europe, their lands provided work for peasants, and their arms supported the poor. For centuries they had been both spiritual and economic anchors, and their ruins today still carry an air of grandeur that speaks of their former power. Yet to Henry VIII, these houses of prayer became obstacles, symbols of a church that no longer bent to the will of the crown. When Henry broke with Rome in the 1530s, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, he set in motion a storm that would sweep away centuries of tradition. His eyes turned toward the monasteries, rich with lands and treasures that could fill his coffers and strengthen his rule. Commissioners were dispatched to Yorkshire and beyond, probing the lives of monks, cataloguing their wealth, and finding excuses to justify closure. Accusations of corruption, whether true or exaggerated, provided convenient cause. The dissolution of the monasteries began, and Yorkshire felt its force with devastating clarity. Great abbeys that had stood for 4 centuries were dismantled in a matter of months. Roofs were stripped, lead melted, libraries scattered, altars smashed. The monks were pensioned off or driven into obscurity, while their lands were sold to nobles and gentry who now rose in power at the expense of the old order. For the people of Yorkshire, the dissolution was not simply a political maneuver, it was a wound to their very way of life. The monasteries had provided food for the hungry, shelter for the traveller, and medicine for the sick. Their destruction left communities adrift and resentment festered. In 1536, anger boiled over into open rebellion. Known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, it was one of the most significant uprisings against Tudor rule. Tens of thousands of Yorkshiremen rose, carrying banners adorned with the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the monasteries, the return of the old faith, and the removal of the king's unpopular advisers. They marched not as lawless rioters, but as pilgrims, convinced their cause was just and holy. Their leaders included local gentry and clergy, men who sought to negotiate rather than destroy, but the sheer scale of the movement alarmed the crown. The rebels occupied York, and their numbers swelled as they pressed their demands. For a moment, it seemed as if Henry might be forced to yield. The pilgrimage was the largest rebellion he faced in his reign, and Yorkshire stood at its heart. Yet Henry, shrewd and ruthless, played for time. Promises of pardon and reform were offered, negotiations opened, and the rebels dispersed, believing they had won a moral victory. But once their strength was scattered, Henry's vengeance came. Leaders were arrested, trials held, and executions carried out with merciless efficiency. Gibbets rose in towns across Yorkshire, their grim display a warning to any who dared defy the king. The monasteries remained closed, their ruins left as reminders of Henry's triumph. The pilgrimage of grace ended not with restoration, but with repression, and Yorkshire was taught once again the hard lesson of royal power. Yet even in defeat, the rebellion revealed the depth of Yorkshire's faith and resilience. The ruins of monasteries did not erase devotion, they became silent witnesses to a faith-driven underground, reshaped but not extinguished. Villagers who once looked to monks for charity now turned to one another, creating new bonds of survival. The county adapted, as it always had, to forces beyond its control, even as memories of betrayal and blood lingered. The Tudor age passed into the Stuart, and with it came new storms. England fractured along lines of politics and religion, and once again Yorkshire became a battleground. The civil war that erupted in 1642 was not a distant conflict. It tore through the towns, castles and fields of the north. Families were divided, loyalties tested, and the clash between king and parliament turned neighbour against neighbour. Yorkshire, with its size and strategic position, was too important to remain on the sidelines. At first, loyalties were mixed. Some of Yorkshire's great families supported Charles I, drawn by tradition and loyalty to monarchy. Others leaned toward Parliament, suspicious of royal authority and sympathetic to Puritan fervour. Towns declared for one side or the other, and soon the county became a patchwork of garrisons and skirmishes. Castles that had once been Norman fortresses were garrisoned anew, their walls echoing with musket fire instead of swords. York itself became a royalist stronghold, its defences strengthened and its loyalty to the king clear. For Parliament, the capture of York became a pressing goal, and the county braced for war. The most decisive clash came in 1644 at the Battle of Marston Moor, just outside York. It was one of the largest battles ever fought on English soil, and its outcome would shape the course of the war. Royalist forces under Prince Rupert sought to relieve the siege of York, while Parliament's army, joined by their Scottish allies, moved to block them. On that summer evening, the two sides met in a battle that raged until nightfall. Muskets thundered, cavalry charged across the fields, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the din of war. By the end, the Royalists were broken. Over 4,000 lay dead, and Yorkshire's soil once again drank deeply of blood. The defeat at Marston Moor was catastrophic for Charles I. His hold on the north collapsed, and with it his hopes of ultimate victory. Yorkshire, once loyal ground, was now firmly under Parliament's control. The war, however, did not end with a single battle. Skirmishes and sieges continued, castles changing hands, towns suffering occupation and plunder. Pontefract Castle, that old bastion of power, became a symbol of defiance. Loyalist to the last, it held out even after the king himself had been executed, enduring multiple sieges before finally surrendering. Its ruins today are a reminder of the stubborn loyalty that Yorkshiremen could show, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The Civil War left deep marks on the county. Economically, towns and villages suffered from disruption, trade was strangled, and farms lay abandoned. Socially, communities were fractured by suspicion and grievance, old friendships torn apart by political allegiance. Spiritually, the conflict deepened divides, with Puritan strictness clashing against more traditional forms of worship. For ordinary Yorkshire folk, survival once again became the central concern. Armies passed through their lands, demanding supplies, taking livestock, and leaving ruin in their wake. The memory of famine from William's harrying centuries earlier may have faded, but the experience of deprivation returned in new form during these wars of brothers and neighbours. Yet as always, Yorkshire endured. When the fighting finally ceased, when castles lay in ruins and gibbets were empty, life resumed. The people who had weathered Viking invasions, Norman repression, and monastic destruction now weathered civil war as well. Their resilience was not only survival, it was identity. Yorkshire's history, through the Tudor and Stuart centuries, was one of being tested again and again, and never entirely broken. The county emerged changed, its monasteries gone, its castles scarred, its loyalties tested. But in their place new forms of society arose. Land passed into new hands, towns slowly recovered, and the minster continued to dominate York's skyline, a reminder of faith and continuity amid upheaval. The lessons of rebellion and civil war lingered, shaping a county that had learned to endure power's cruelty while never quite surrendering its pride. The story of Yorkshire in these centuries is not simply one of kings and battles, but of people, monks driven from their abbeys, villagers rising in pilgrimage, soldiers fighting in muddy fields, families torn by divided loyalties. It is a story of resilience in the face of rulers who demanded obedience and wars that demanded blood. And though the Tudors and Stuarts left behind scars, they also left Yorkshire with a legacy of memory, strength, and endurance that would carry it forward into new ages of change. Chapter 8. The Georgian Era and the Age of Elegance. The smoke of civil war had faded, the echoes of cannon at Marston Moor and the ruin of castles like Pontefract slipped slowly into memory. By the early 18th century, Yorkshire was ready to breathe again. After centuries defined by invasion, rebellion, and the clash of armies, a new chapter opened, one marked not by fire and famine, but by refinement, elegance, and a different kind of ambition. This was the Georgian age, when fashion and leisure shaped the lives of the wealthy, when towns like York and Harrogate became destinations of charm and sophistication, and when the countryside blossomed with great houses and sweeping gardens. It was a time of prosperity and taste, of social display and cultural flowering, a calm before the storm that industry would soon unleash. York, long a city of power, found itself reborn in this period as a place of elegance. The old medieval city with its narrow lanes and ancient walls did not vanish, but it was joined by graceful Georgian streets lined with townhouses whose symmetrical facades and sash windows reflected a new architectural order. The great and the good of Yorkshire society flocked to York during the season, transforming it into a northern rival to London and Bath. Assembly rooms were built where the county's gentry gathered to dance, play cards, and engage in the polite rituals of sociability. The city, once the seat of Viking kings and Norman conquerors, now became a stage for powdered wigs, silk gowns, and the careful art of conversation. The minster still towered over the skyline, but beneath its shadow, life pulsed with a new rhythm of refinement. At the same time, the rise of spa culture transformed Yorkshire's landscape. Harrogate, once a modest village, gained fame for the healing qualities of its waters. Visitors came to take the waters, convinced that the mineral springs could cure ailments ranging from gout to melancholy. Elegant pump rooms and bathhouses were constructed to accommodate the influx, and the town flourished as a fashionable retreat. To stroll through Harrogate's parks in the 18th century was to hear a hum of polite chatter, to see ladies with parasols and gentlemen in fine coats sipping the bitter sulphur water with grim determination, persuaded that its taste of rotten eggs masked miraculous powers. The very act of enduring the waters became a mark of refinement, a shared ritual of health and fashion. Harrogate, like Bath, was a place where society gathered not merely for cure, but for display, a theatre of elegance where connections were forged and reputations made. Other towns joined this age of refinement. Scarborough, with its sea bathing, became a popular destination, its cliffside views and salty air offering both health and delight. The coast, once feared for raiders and storms, was reimagined as a place of leisure. Yorkshire, always defined by its rugged landscape and resilience, now revealed another face, that of beauty and pleasure, of elegance sought in waters, gardens, and seaside air. Beyond the towns, the countryside itself bore witness to Georgian ambition. Across Yorkshire, aristocrats and landowners raised country houses of astonishing scale and grace. Castle Howard, with its sweeping dome and elaborate gardens, became one of the most celebrated estates in England, a vision of grandeur rising from rolling parkland. Harewood House, built in the Palladian style, proclaimed the wealth and taste of its owners, its interiors filled with fine art, and its grounds sculpted by Capability Brown, the master of landscape design. These houses were not merely homes, they were statements of status, monuments to prosperity and taste. To walk their halls was to enter a world of marble, gilt, and polished wood, where every detail spoke of wealth displayed and elegance performed. The gardens of these estates were no less ambitious. The formal, rigid patterns of earlier centuries gave way to sweeping landscapes that sought to imitate nature while improving upon it. Lakes were dug, hills reshaped, groves planted to frame views that seemed timeless but were carefully constructed illusions. Strolling through such grounds, one could feel both the power of human artifice and the serenity of nature curated. These landscapes became stages for leisure, where guests wandered, conversed, and admired the harmony of man and land. Yorkshire's rolling hills and valleys, once scars of conquest and rebellion, now became canvases for beauty, reshaped into visions of elegance that still draw admiration today. Prosperity underpinned this age. Yorkshire's wool continued to provide wealth, and agriculture thrived in a county blessed with fertile land. Markets grew, trade expanded, and towns bustled with new activity. The gentry, enriched by their estates, invested in display and culture. Patronage of the arts flourished, music filled the assembly rooms, and literature circulated among polite society. Yorkshire, though far from London, was not provincial. It was part of a wider world of taste and refinement, a participant in the Georgian age's pursuit of elegance. Yet beneath the polished surface, not all was harmonious. The prosperity of the few often rested upon the labour of the many. The grandeur of Castle Howard was built on the toil of servants and workers who lived lives far removed from the gilded rooms they served. The spas that drew fashionable visitors offered little to the poor who could not afford their cures. The rural population, though tied to the rhythms of farming, often lived precariously, subject to harvests and rents. Even as Yorkshire basked in elegance, divisions of class remained stark. The age of refinement was real, but it was not universal. For the many, life remained harsh, their toil the foundation upon which the few displayed their grace. Still, the Georgian period brought a measure of stability that had long eluded Yorkshire. The fires of rebellion that had burned so fiercely in the Tudor and Stuart centuries were quieted. The county, once ravaged by famine and war, now enjoyed peace, at least on its own soil. This peace allowed culture to flourish, architecture to rise, and society to polish itself in ways that seemed almost miraculous after centuries of turmoil. The ruins of monasteries left by Henry VIII became picturesque features of the landscape, admired by visitors who saw in them not tragedy, but romantic beauty. The past was reimagined as part of the aesthetic, folded into the elegance of the present. The Georgian age also deepened Yorkshire's sense of identity. To be from Yorkshire in this period was to belong to a county of refinement and pride, a place where towns like York stood as cultural centres, where estates rivalled any in the kingdom, and where spas and seaside resorts drew visitors from far beyond. The people of the county, from the gentry in their grand houses to the merchants in their growing towns, began to see themselves not as subjects of survival, but as participants in prosperity. Yorkshire's old reputation for resilience was joined now by a reputation for grace. As the 18th century drew to its close, however, clouds gathered on the horizon. Beyond the manicured gardens and candlelit assemblies, change was stirring. The forces of industry, coal, iron, steam, and mills, were beginning to reshape the nation. Yorkshire, with its resources and energy, would soon be at the forefront of this transformation. But for a time, in the Georgian era, the county basked in an age of elegance, enjoying prosperity and refinement before the storm broke. It was a rare moment of harmony in a history often marked by strife, a moment when beauty, culture, and prosperity seemed to balance, if only for a while. The legacy of this age lingers still. The streets of Georgian York, the gardens of Castle Howard, the ruins of abbeys admired as romantic landscapes, the pump rooms of Harrogate, all speak of a time when Yorkshire embraced elegance, when its people sought not merely to endure, but to refine. It was a chapter of beauty in a story so often written in blood, a reminder that Yorkshire was not only a land of resilience, but of aspiration. The Georgian age may have been brief, but it left behind a vision of grace that endures alongside the memory of battles and scars. And as the county stood on the threshold of industry, it carried with it the taste of refinement that had defined its most elegant age. Chapter 9. The Industrial Revolution in Yorkshire. The Georgian age had given Yorkshire an air of elegance, its towns and country houses gleaming with refinement, its spas and assembly rooms humming with polite conversation. Yet beneath this veneer of grace, forces were already stirring that would transform not only Yorkshire, but the entire world. The 18th century's taste for refinement was about to give way to the grit of industry, to coal's smoke rising above valleys, to iron forged in furnaces, and to the thunder of locomotives racing across the landscape. Yorkshire, with its resources of wool, coal and iron, stood at the very heart of the Industrial Revolution. Its cities, Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, Hull, grew from provincial centres into engines of empire, powering Britain's transformation and leaving behind both prosperity and hardship in equal measure. For centuries, Yorkshire's economy had been built upon wool. The sheep that grazed its dales and moors provided fleeces that were spun and woven into cloth, traded across Europe and cherished as one of England's great exports. But in the Industrial Revolution, wool became not merely a craft but an industry. In Leeds and Bradford, mills rose like cathedrals of a new age. Instead of spinners working in cottages, machines powered by water and, later, by steam, turned wool into cloth at an unprecedented scale. The rhythmic clatter of looms filled the air, their relentless motion producing textiles that clothed not only Britain but markets across the globe. Leeds, once a modest market town, became a booming centre of woolen manufacture, its population swelling as workers poured in from the countryside, seeking wages in the mills. Bradford too grew with astonishing speed, its name becoming synonymous with the worsted trade, fine cloth spun and woven for the world. In these cities, wealth was created at a pace previously unimagined, but so too was poverty, as workers toiled long hours in dangerous conditions for meagre pay. Yorkshire's wool had clothed Europe for centuries, but now it clothed the world, and its price was measured not only in profit but in human cost. Coal fueled this transformation. Beneath Yorkshire's soil lay rich seams of black gold, and as mills, factories and furnaces demanded power, mines spread across the county. In towns like Barnsley, Wakefield and Doncaster, pits were sunk, and men and boys descended daily into the darkness, hacking at seams, hauling coal to the surface. It was dangerous work. Explosions, cave-ins and choking dust claimed countless lives. Yet without coal, the factories above ground could not run, the steam engines could not turn, and the railways could not race across the land. Coal became Yorkshire's lifeblood, its extraction both a source of wealth and a burden borne by those who risked their lives beneath the earth. The landscape itself changed, dotted with spoil heaps and pitheads, the rhythm of mining life-shaping communities that grew around collieries. Songs and stories from these mining villages carried both pride and sorrow, for coal gave Yorkshire power, but at a human cost that could never be ignored. If wool was Yorkshire's past and coal its engine, then steel was its pride. Nowhere is this more evident than in Sheffield, the city that became known around the world for its blades. For centuries, Sheffield's cutlers had been renowned for their skill, forging knives, scissors and tools of high quality. But the Industrial Revolution gave Sheffield new tools and new markets. The invention of crucible steel in the 18th century, perfected in the city, allowed for steel of unparalleled strength and consistency. Later, the Bessemer process made mass production possible, and Sheffield became the steel capital of the world. Its furnaces glowed day and night, casting ingots that would be shaped into rails, tools, weapons, and countless other goods. Made in Sheffield became a mark of quality recognized across continents. Yet this achievement was no simple story of triumph. The roar of the furnaces, the smoke that darkened the skies, and the relentless labor of those who fed the fires created an environment as harsh as it was productive. The wealth that poured from steel was immense, but so too was the toil of those who earned it. The transformation of Yorkshire was not only industrial, but infrastructural. The coming of the railways bound the county together, and tied it to the wider world. Leeds and Bradford, Sheffield and Hull were no longer isolated centres but linked by iron rails that carried goods and people with unprecedented speed. The Stockton and Darlington Railway to the north and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway to the west inspired lines that reached deep into Yorkshire, bringing coal from pit to factory, wool from mill to market, and steel from furnace to port. Trains thundered through valleys, across viaducts and into cities, their whistles heralding a new age of mobility. For the first time, the ordinary people of Yorkshire could travel far beyond their villages, seeing parts of the country they had only heard of before. The railways shrank distances, collapsed time, and made Yorkshire not a remote northern county but a hub of Britain's industrial might. Hull, though not an industrial city in the same sense as Leeds or Sheffield, played a vital role as Yorkshire's gateway to the sea. Its docks expanded, its ships carried wool, coal, and manufactured goods to markets abroad, and in return raw materials and food flowed in. Hull's fishing fleets reached far into the North Sea, bringing back the catch that fed growing cities. It became a city of trade and commerce, its fortunes tied to the industrial products of the county behind it. Without Hull, Yorkshire's wool, coal and steel would have remained trapped inland. With Hull, they reached the world, making Yorkshire a global player in the Industrial Revolution. The human story of this age is as compelling as the industrial one. The growth of cities was staggering. Leeds, Bradford and Sheffield expanded at dizzying speed, their populations multiplying as rural families flocked to urban centres. Rows of back-to-back houses sprang up, hastily built to houseworkers, their cramped and unsanitary conditions a stark contrast to the grand townhouses of mill owners and merchants. Diseases spread rapidly, child mortality was high, and poverty was endemic. Yet amid the hardship, a new kind of community life developed. Chapels and schools were built, working men's clubs flourished, and political movements began to stir as workers demanded better conditions. Yorkshire was not only building cloth, coal and steel, it was building class consciousness, the seeds of reform that would shape the future of Britain. The contrasts of the age were striking. On one hand, the stately Georgian houses and landscapes continued to shine, their owners enriched further by industrial wealth. On the other, the streets of industrial Leeds or Sheffield echoed, with the cries of children sent to work in mills or mines, with the coughs of men whose lungs were filled with coal dust, with the exhaustion of women who balanced factory shifts with family life. The Industrial Revolution brought prosperity, but it was unevenly spread. It brought power, but also exploitation. Yorkshire, as ever, bore both the glory and the burden, yet despite the suffering, there was also pride. To work in a Yorkshire mill, mine or forge was to be part of something greater, to know that the labour of one's hands was helping to build a nation's power. The wool of Leeds and Bradford clothed the world. The steel of Sheffield built railways and bridges across continents. The coal of Barnsley and Wakefield fuelled engines that drove the empire. Hull's ships carried Yorkshire's name to distant ports. The people of the county, though often living in hardship, could see their work shaping history. It was an age of transformation so profound that it is difficult to imagine Britain or the modern world without it. By the mid-19th century, Yorkshire was a giant of industry, a powerhouse of cloth, coal, steel and trade. Its cities had grown from provincial centres into global players. Its landscape had been reshaped by mines, mills, railways and docks. Its people, though burdened, had forged new identities in the furnace of industrial life. The Georgian elegance of York and Harrogate had not vanished, but it now existed alongside the grit and smoke of Leeds and Sheffield. Yorkshire was a county of contrasts where refinement and industry, wealth and poverty, beauty and brutality coexisted. It was a land transformed, and its influence reached far beyond its borders, helping to drive Britain's rise as the workshop of the world. The Industrial Revolution was not a chapter Yorkshire merely participated in, it was a chapter Yorkshire wrote. And as the 19th century advanced, its cities and people would continue to shape the destiny not only of the county but of Britain itself. For better and for worse, Yorkshire's wool, coal, steel and railways had changed the world forever. Chapter 10. Victorian Yorkshire. By the middle of the 19th century, Yorkshire stood at the heart of the industrial world. The mills of Leeds and Bradford thundered without pause, Sheffield's furnaces blazed night and day, and the coal pits of Barnsley and Wakefield dug ever deeper to feed the appetite of a growing nation. The railways had stitched the county together and tied it to every corner of Britain, while Hull's docks carried goods to the seas and brought back the resources of empire. It was a time of astonishing change, of new wealth and new opportunity, but also of stark contrasts. The Victorian age in Yorkshire revealed the best and the worst of progress. Industry barons building fortunes of staggering scale, children sent to work in grim conditions, reformers rising to challenge injustice, and, amid it all, a society discovering new forms of leisure, from rail excursions to the seaside at Scarborough. It was an age of ambition, contradiction, and transformation, one that shaped the Yorkshire we still recognise today. The wealth of Yorkshire's cities was dazzling to behold. In Leeds, textile magnates built grand houses on the edges of town, their drawing rooms filled with fine furniture, their halls hung with portraits that proclaimed their success. In Bradford, mill owners grew rich from the worsted trade, their fortunes woven into cloth that reached every corner of the globe. In Sheffield, steelmasters commanded empires of iron and fire, their names stamped on goods exported worldwide. These men, often self-made, became the barons of industry, their power rivaling that of the old aristocracy. Their philanthropy could be generous. Schools, libraries, and hospitals were sometimes built from their donations, but their wealth rested on the backs of thousands of workers who laboured for long hours in harsh conditions. The contrast between mansion and mill, between the villa on the hill and the back-to-back houses in the valley, was impossible to ignore. The workers who fed this industrial machine lived lives of endurance. In the smoky streets of Leeds or the crowded alleys of Bradford, families were packed into cramped housing with poor sanitation. Diseases such as cholera and typhus spread quickly, and child mortality rates were appallingly high. In Sheffield, the men who worked the forges often suffered grinder's lung from inhaling dust, their lives cut short, even as their work produced blades admired across the world. In the coalfields, boys as young as 6 or 7 were sent underground, tasked with opening and closing ventilation doors or hauling wagons through low tunnels. Girls worked long shifts in textile mills, tending machines that could maim in an instant. The Industrial Revolution had created new wealth, but it demanded a terrible price, paid most heavily by the youngest and the poorest. Yet out of this hardship rose voices of protest and reform. Yorkshire became a crucible for social change, its conditions too dire to ignore. Chartist meetings drew thousands, demanding voting rights for working men. Reformers such as Richard Oastler, known as the Factory King, campaigned fiercely against child labour, exposing the horrors of children working 14-hour shifts in mills. His tireless agitation helped pave the way for the Factory Acts, which began to limit hours and improve conditions. In Leeds and Bradford, nonconformist churches and chapels became centres of community support, offering education, moral guidance, and charity. Trade unions slowly gained strength, their members risking jobs and imprisonment to demand better wages and safer conditions. The Victorian age in Yorkshire was not only an era of suffering, it was also an era of awakening, when injustice began to be challenged and reform took root. The railways, which had first been built to carry coal and cloth, soon reshaped society in other ways. They opened new possibilities for ordinary people who could now travel at speeds unthinkable only decades earlier. A worker in Leeds could take a train to Scarborough for a day by the sea, something his grandparents could never have imagined. Excursion trains offered cheap fares, and soon the seaside became a cherished part of Victorian leisure. Scarborough, with its sandy beaches, cliffside views and sea air, flourished as a resort town. Hotels rose, bathing machines lined the shore, and visitors strolled along promenades. The sea, once feared for storms and raiders, was now embraced as a place of health and recreation. Children who had grown up in the smoky alleys of industrial towns first glimpsed the waves from Scarborough's sands, their laughter mixing with the cries of gulls. The railway had democratized leisure, giving even the working classes a taste of escape. Other towns, too, enjoyed this new age of leisure. Harrogate, already famous for its waters, thrived as a spa destination, drawing visitors from across Britain who came to take the cure in elegant pump rooms and leafy parks. York, with its Georgian elegance and medieval minster, became a centre of tourism, its heritage admired as part of a growing Victorian fascination with history. Even the ruins of monasteries, once symbols of destruction, were reimagined as romantic sites, their ivy-clad arches admired by visitors, sketching them in notebooks. The Victorians, with their love of progress, also developed a taste for the past, and Yorkshire provided it in abundance. The contrasts of Victorian Yorkshire were everywhere. In one part of a city, children played with buckets and spades on a seaside excursion, their families savouring a day of leisure. In another, children of the same age worked in mills until exhaustion, their hands raw from tending machines. In one house, a wealthy merchant dined beneath chandeliers. In another, a labourer's family ate bread and dripping by candlelight in a room shared by 6. These contrasts defined the age, and Yorkshire, with its extremes of wealth and poverty, embodied them more starkly than most. Still, the Victorian period brought improvements. Public health reforms began to tackle the cholera outbreaks that plagued cities, bringing cleaner water and better sanitation. Schools were established, giving children opportunities for education that their parents had never known. Philanthropists funded libraries and museums, eager to elevate the minds of the working classes. Parks were laid out, offering green spaces where urban families could breathe fresh air. In Sheffield, the creation of public gardens offered respite from the smoke of industry. In Leeds, civic pride inspired the building of a grand town hall, its tower rising as a symbol of confidence in the city's future. Bradford, too, boasted fine civic buildings that proclaimed its importance. Victorian Yorkshire was a place not only of hardship, but of ambition, where communities sought to improve themselves even amid the challenges of rapid growth. The sense of identity grew stronger. Yorkshire workers, whether in mines, mills, or foundries, began to see themselves as part of a shared struggle, their voices amplified through unions, chapels, and political movements. Pride in work was mixed with awareness of injustice, and this duality shaped the culture of the county. The dialects carried Norse words from centuries past, the traditions of resilience carried echoes of famine and war, and now the experiences of factory life and social reform added new layers. Yorkshire was forging not only steel but a new consciousness, one that would resonate in the politics of the nation. By the end of the 19th century, Yorkshire had been utterly transformed. Its cities had grown into sprawling industrial giants, their populations swelling with migrants from rural areas and from Ireland. Smoke still hung heavy in the air, but so too did a sense of progress. Railways carried goods and people in and out of the county at unprecedented speed. Seaside holidays were no longer rare luxuries but annual expectations for many families. Social reforms had begun to ease the worst abuses of labour, though much remained to be done. Industry barons still held immense wealth, but the working classes had gained new strength, their voices echoing in Parliament and in the streets. Victorian Yorkshire was thus a land of paradox, immense wealth and grinding poverty, suffering and reform, toil and leisure. It was a place where a boy might spend his childhood underground in a coal seam, while another of the same age might ride a train to Scarborough for a day at the beach. It was a place where smoke-blackened factories stood alongside libraries and museums, where civic pride rose as high as chimneys, and where communities balanced survival with aspiration. It was a place of struggle, but also of hope. The Industrial Revolution had set the stage, but it was in the Victorian age that Yorkshire fully revealed the human cost and the human potential of that transformation. The county's mills, mines, railways and docks shaped Britain's power, but its people shaped its conscience. Reformers, workers and industrialists together forged a society of contrasts that still defines Yorkshire's character. It was not an easy age, nor a gentle one, but it was a defining chapter in the story of a county that has always known how to endure, adapt, and create. Chapter 11. War and Resilience. The 19th century had left Yorkshire transformed, its cities booming with industry, its people divided by wealth and poverty, but bound together by shared struggle, its railways carrying both goods and families to new horizons. Yet all the progress of the Victorian age and all the pride of Yorkshire's industrial might would be tested in ways unimaginable. The 20th century brought with it the shadow of World War, not once but twice, and in those years Yorkshire's resilience was put to its hardest trial. The county's men marched in their thousands to battlefields far from home, its towns endured air raids and destruction, and its villages suffered losses so deep that scars remained for generations. Yet through it all, Yorkshire stood firm, scarred but unbroken, proving once again that endurance was the heart of its character. When war erupted in 1914, Yorkshire responded with both patriotism and duty. Across the county, young men rushed to enlist, joining the wave of volunteers that surged into Britain's armies. Nowhere is this spirit better remembered than in the story of the Barnsley Pals. In the early months of the First World War, the government encouraged towns and communities to form Pals battalions, units composed of men who knew one another, friends, neighbours, workmates, who would serve together. Barnsley answered with pride, raising 2 battalions that became part of the York and Lancaster Regiment. For the men of Barnsley, the promise was clear. You would fight side by side with those you grew up with, the camaraderie of home carried into the trenches. For their families, it was reassurance that their sons and brothers would not face the horrors of war alone. The reality was harsher. On the 1st of July 1916, the Barnsley Pals went into action on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, one of the most infamous days in British military history. Across the front, tens of thousands of British soldiers were cut down as they advanced into machine gun fire. The Pals battalions, attacking with courage but little chance, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire streets in Barnsley lost their sons in a single day. The promise of camaraderie became the cruelty of shared tragedy, for when Pals battalions fell, whole communities grieved together. The Somme seared itself into Yorkshire's memory not only as a battlefield, but as a wound carried in the heart of towns and villages for generations. The Barnsley Pals were not alone. Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford and other cities had their own Pals units, each suffering grievous losses, but their story remains emblematic of Yorkshire's sacrifice. The First World War reshaped life at home as well. The mills and factories of Yorkshire turned to war production, weaving uniforms, forging weapons, and producing munitions. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking the places of men who had gone to the front. In Leeds, Bradford and Sheffield, the rhythm of industrial life continued, but now with the urgency of war. Food was rationed, families endured the absence of fathers and sons, and casualty lists printed in local papers brought the grim reality of the Western Front into every home. Villages that had once been defined by their markets or mines were now defined by the absence of their young men, the silence of fields where fathers had tilled the soil, and the grief of mothers who waited in vain. Yet even amid the sorrow, Yorkshire endured. Communities supported one another, raised funds for war charities, and kept alive the determination that their sacrifice would not be in vain. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Yorkshire, like the rest of Britain, was forever changed. Memorials were raised in towns and villages, their names etched in stone, each one a reminder of lives lost and families broken. In tiny hamlets and sprawling cities alike, cenotaphs stood as symbols of both pride and grief. The Barnsley Pals, the Leeds Pals, the Sheffield Pals all became legends, their stories passed down not as tales of glory, but of endurance and sacrifice. The war had scarred Yorkshire, but it had not broken it, and scarcely a generation later the county would be called upon once again. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 found Yorkshire ready to endure, though the challenges it faced were different from those of 1914. Once again, men went off to fight in distant lands, France, North Africa, Italy, and beyond. But this time the war came directly to Yorkshire's own towns and cities. The Luftwaffe, seeking to cripple Britain's industry and break its spirit, launched devastating bombing campaigns against the north. Hull, as a major port and industrial hub, suffered particularly cruelly. The Hull Blitz, as it became known, turned vast parts of the city to rubble. Night after night, bombs rained down, homes were destroyed, families killed, and streets reduced to smouldering ruins. Hull endured more than 80 raids, its docks and factories targeted, but its people bore the assault with remarkable resilience. Shelters were dug, communities rallied, and even as buildings fell, the spirit of the city remained unbroken. The scars of the Blitz shaped Hull for decades, but so too did the pride of having endured it. Other cities in Yorkshire also felt the terror of air raids. Sheffield, with its steelworks vital to the production of armaments, was heavily targeted. In December 1940, the Sheffield Blitz brought death and destruction to the city, firestorms sweeping through streets as incendiary bombs lit the night sky. Leeds and Bradford were struck as well, though less severely, their factories and railways too important to be ignored by the Luftwaffe. For ordinary people, life was lived in the shadow of sirens, the rush to shelters, and the grim wait for the all clear. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside, their journeys carrying them away from parents but also away from danger. Yorkshire once again became a land of sacrifice, not only of men on battlefields but of families at home. Amid the destruction, the county continued to play a vital role in the war effort. Sheffield's furnaces poured out steel for tanks, planes and ships. Leeds produced munitions and military equipment. The coal mines, still essential, powered the war machine. Women again stepped into roles once reserved for men, their work in factories and fields indispensable. The resilience of Yorkshire was measured not only in enduring bombs but in sustaining the fight, keeping the engines of war turning no matter the cost. In villages and towns, rationing shaped diets, blackouts darkened nights, and communities adapted with the same stubborn endurance that had carried them through centuries of hardship. The stories of courage and sacrifice were countless. Barnsley, which had given so much in the First World War, again sent its sons to fight in the Second. Farmers across the Dales increased production to feed the nation, their labour vital in the face of U-boat blockades. Women of the Women's Voluntary Service organised shelters, cared for evacuees, and kept spirits alive. Fire brigades fought through nights of bombing to save what they could, often at great cost. In every corner of Yorkshire, the war was not an abstraction but a daily reality, endured with grit and determination. When victory finally came in 1945, the celebrations in Yorkshire were heartfelt but tempered. The joy of peace was mingled with the memory of loss, of sons who would not return, of homes destroyed, of communities reshaped by 6 years of struggle. Yet the resilience of the county had prevailed. The Barnsley Pals, the Hull Blitz, the Sheffield steelworkers, the countless unnamed men and women who had endured rationing, bombing and hardship, all were part of a story of endurance that defined Yorkshire's experience of the wars. Scarred, yes, but unbroken. The cenotaphs of the First World War now stood beside the memories of the Second, together bearing witness to Yorkshire's sacrifices in the greatest conflicts the world had known. The legacy of these wars was profound. The losses reshaped families, the destruction reshaped cities, and the shared experience reshaped identity. Yorkshire's resilience became not just a necessity but a point of pride, a recognition that in the face of overwhelming hardship, the county had endured. Its people had faced famine under William the Conqueror, raids under the Vikings, battles under the Wars of the Roses, and now bombs from the skies. Each time they had risen again. The world wars were perhaps the greatest test of all, and Yorkshire passed that test with the same stubborn strength that had carried it for centuries. As the 20th century moved forward, new challenges would arise: the decline of industries, the struggles of modernity, the search for identity in a changing world. But the memory of war and resilience remained, etched into the stones of memorials, into the ruins left by bombs, into the stories told by families who remembered. Yorkshire's history in the world wars is not simply one of destruction, it is one of endurance, sacrifice, and unbroken spirit. And as the county stepped into the modern age, it carried with it the hard-earned pride of having faced the darkest of times and survived. Chapter 12. Modern Yorkshire. Pride and Identity. The wars had scarred Yorkshire but had not broken it. By 1945, the county stood proud of its sacrifices, proud of its resilience, and ready to face the challenges of peace. Yet the world that emerged after the Second World War was unlike anything that had come before. The great furnaces that had glowed day and night, the pits that had sustained whole villages, the mills that had clothed the world, these pillars of Yorkshire's industrial power began to falter. Change came slowly at first, then with gathering force, and the Yorkshire of the late 20th century found itself reshaped not by conquest or rebellion, but by the quieter, more relentless forces of economic decline, migration, and cultural renewal. Out of these changes, however, came something enduring, a modern identity forged not in steel or coal, but in pride, diversity, and an unshakable sense of belonging. The decline of industry was perhaps the greatest upheaval since the arrival of the Normans. For generations, families in towns like Sheffield, Barnsley, Leeds, and Bradford had built their lives around the pit, the mill, or the forge. Work was not just a livelihood, it was an identity, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. To be a miner, a steelworker, or a mill hand was to belong to a community defined by labour, solidarity, and pride. But in the decades after the war, one by one, these industries faltered. Cheap imports undercut Yorkshire's textiles, steel production shifted abroad. Coal, once the lifeblood of the nation, was declared uneconomic, pits closed, and entire villages faced unemployment. Streets that had echoed with the shift-change whistle now fell silent. The skyline, once marked by chimneys and pitheads, grew empty. For many, it was not just jobs that were lost, but the very meaning of community. The closures of the 1970s and 1980s, particularly during the miners' strike of 1984 to 85, were moments of profound trauma. Yorkshire's coalfields became battlegrounds once more, not of swords or muskets, but of picket lines and police charges. Families were divided, communities strained, and scars were left that remain visible to this day. Yet even as industry collapsed, the spirit of Yorkshire did not. Where pits closed, towns turned to new forms of employment. Where mills fell silent, universities, service industries, and cultural institutions grew. It was not an easy transition, far from it, but Yorkshire endured, reshaping itself for a new age. Alongside economic change came demographic transformation. After the war, new waves of migration arrived in Yorkshire, reshaping its cities and enriching its culture. Bradford, Leeds, and Sheffield became homes to communities from South Asia, particularly Pakistan and India, as well as the Caribbean and Eastern Europe. They came to work in mills and factories to rebuild a nation that had been exhausted by war. At first, their presence was met with uncertainty, sometimes with hostility, as communities adjusted to difference, but over time their traditions became woven into the fabric of Yorkshire life. Curry houses in Bradford became as iconic as fish and chip shops in seaside towns. Festivals brought new colours and rhythms to city streets. Mosques rose alongside churches, temples alongside chapels. Yorkshire, once thought of as a county defined by its Anglo-Saxon and Norse roots, became a county of diversity, its identity broadened and deepened by new voices, new stories, and new traditions. This diversity did not erase Yorkshire's character, it enriched it. To be Yorkshire in the modern age meant not only to honour the past, but to embrace the present, to recognise that identity was not fixed, but evolving. The grit of miners, the skill of steelworkers, the pride of mill towns, these values of resilience, hard work, and loyalty were carried forward, shared by newcomers as well as natives. In cricket grounds and schoolyards, in markets and pubs, a shared sense of Yorkshire pride took root, transcending origin or faith. The county became both old and new, its history honoured, its present transformed, its future shaped by many hands. Amid all this change, certain traditions continued to anchor Yorkshire's sense of self. Cricket at Headingley remained a passion bordering on religion, the roar of the crowd greeting every boundary, the silence heavy with tension between deliveries. For generations, Yorkshire cricket had produced giants of the sport, men like Len Hutton, Geoffrey Boycott, and more recently Joe Root, figures who carried the county's name onto the international stage. To wear the white rose on a cricket cap was to carry centuries of pride, and Headingley's stands became a place where Yorkshire's identity was celebrated in bat and ball. Food, too, carried the county's sense of belonging. The Yorkshire pudding, once a humble dish meant to stretch a Sunday roast, became a symbol of home itself. Crispy at the edges, soft at the centre, it stood as a culinary emblem of Yorkshire resourcefulness, a dish that turned little into plenty. To sit down to Sunday lunch with Yorkshire pudding was to participate in something greater than a meal. It was to share in heritage. In pubs and kitchens across the county, this tradition bound families together, a small but powerful ritual of identity. Modern Yorkshire also found pride in its culture. Writers, artists, and musicians emerged from its cities and towns, giving voice to experiences both local and universal. The Bronte sisters, whose moorland novels had spoken of passion and endurance, were rediscovered with fresh admiration, their works symbols of Yorkshire's literary spirit. Musicians from Sheffield and Leeds found international fame, carrying the county's voice into new genres. Theatres in York, Leeds, and Sheffield flourished, and festivals celebrated not only Yorkshire traditions but global creativity. The county was no longer defined solely by its industrial might. It had become a cultural force as well. And yet, for all the change, for all the loss and renewal, one thread runs unbroken: pride. To be from Yorkshire in the modern age is to carry an identity rooted in history, but alive in the present. It is to walk the moors of Bronte country and feel the weight of centuries. It is to stand in the ruins of Fountains Abbey and remember the age of monks and pilgrims. It is to look upon York Minster and know that faith and endurance have always defined this land. It is to watch cricket at Headingley, to eat Yorkshire pudding at Sunday lunch, to hear the lilt of dialect in markets and streets, and to feel that all of it belongs to something larger than oneself. This pride is not arrogance, though it may sometimes be mistaken for it. It is the pride of resilience, of knowing that Yorkshire has endured Vikings and Normans, Tudors and Stuarts, wars and strikes, decline and renewal. It is the pride of a county that has given the world cloth and steel, literature and sport, courage and defiance. It is a pride that welcomes newcomers, for to live in Yorkshire is to become part of its story, no matter where you were born. It is a pride that laughs at itself as often as it boasts, for Yorkshire wit is as sharp as Sheffield steel and as enduring as the Dales. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Yorkshire continued to evolve. Its cities reinvented themselves with universities, finance, and culture at their core. Leeds became a hub of business and media. Sheffield turned from steel to innovation and technology. Bradford celebrated its status as a city of film and storytelling. Hull, once battered by bombs, embraced the sea as a source of renewal, crowned as City of Culture in 2017. The Dales and Moors drew walkers and writers, tourists and dreamers, their landscapes as timeless as the people who walked them. Yorkshire today is not the Yorkshire of the mills or the pits, but it is no less proud, no less resilient, no less itself. To ask what it means to be Yorkshire today is to receive 1,000 answers. For some it is about cricket and puddings, for others about history and landscape, for still others about community and diversity. But beneath the variety, the essence is the same: a fierce sense of belonging, a stubborn resilience, a refusal to be broken. Yorkshire may have lost its industries, its mills may stand in silence, its pits may be filled, but its spirit endures. It endures in the pride of its people, in the traditions carried forward, and in the new voices that have joined the chorus. The story of Yorkshire has always been one of survival, of adaptation, of pride in identity. In the modern age, that identity is no longer forged in coal or steel, but in memory, in culture, in community. From Headingley to Harrogate, from Scarborough's sands to Sheffield's streets, From the ruins of abbeys to the glass towers of Leeds, Yorkshire lives on, diverse, proud, unbroken. And as long as Sunday tables carry Yorkshire puddings, as long as cricket balls strike willow at Headingley, and as long as its people declare, with a smile and a glint of stubborn pride, "I'm from Yorkshire," the story will never end. Chapter 13. God's Own County. To tell the story of Yorkshire is to tell the story of endurance, across the sweep of thousands of years, from the Ice Age hunters in Creswell Crags to the glass towers of modern Leeds. This land has been shaped and reshaped by conquest, by faith, by hardship, and by ambition. It has known famine and prosperity, bloodshed and beauty, ruin and renewal. Yet through every age, through every change, one thread has held steady. Yorkshire's character, forged in the furnace of history, unyielding, resilient, and proud. It is no accident that today it is called God's Own County. That title is not merely a boast, it is the echo of centuries, a recognition that Yorkshire has always been something greater than the sum of its parts. The legacy of Yorkshire lies not only in its monuments, but in its memory. The Roman walls of York, the ruined abbeys of Fountains and Rievaulx, the castles of Richmond and Pontefract, the mills of Leeds and Bradford, the steelworks of Sheffield, the pits of Barnsley, each tells part of the story. They stand as witnesses to the passage of time, reminders that nothing is permanent except the spirit that endures. Walk through York Minster and you hear the prayers of centuries rising into the vaulted air. Stand on the battlefield at Towton, and you feel the silence of tens of thousands who fell in a single day. Visit the quiet villages where cenotaphs list the names of the Barnsley pals, and you sense the weight of sacrifice. These places are not simply relics, they are living testaments to the resilience that defines this land. Yorkshire's character was forged in hardship, but it has always found beauty in the struggle. The Viking invasion left fire and ruin, yet from it rose Jorvik, a bustling city of trade and culture. William the Conqueror's harrying turned fields to wasteland, yet out of the ashes the people rebuilt, raising cathedrals and monasteries that became jewels of medieval Europe. The dissolution swept away centuries of monastic life, yet Yorkshire answered with rebellion and then endured to see its towns flourish anew. The Civil War scarred its castles and divided its families, yet Yorkshire rose again with industry, powering an empire with its coal, steel, and wool. The decline of that industry in the 20th century brought unemployment and hardship, yet still Yorkshire adapted, reshaping itself for a modern world. Each time the story is the same. Adversity strikes and Yorkshire endures. This endurance is not passive, it is active, stubborn, and proud. It is found in the humour of its people, sharp and dry, cutting as cleanly as any Sheffield blade. It is found in the rhythm of its speech, where old Norse words still mingle with English, carrying echoes of settlers long gone. It is found in the moors and dales, landscapes that seem eternal, where wind and rain test those who walk them, but reward endurance with beauty. It is found in the cricket grounds where patience and pride merge, where the game is more than sport, it is tradition. It is found in the kitchens where Yorkshire pudding rises in the oven, simple and hearty, a symbol of making much from little. Yorkshire's resilience is not only in its history, it is in its daily life, in its customs, its humour and its pride. To call Yorkshire God's Own County is to recognise its sense of itself, a pride that can sometimes seem fierce, even stubborn, but which is rooted in truth. Nowhere else in Britain claims identity with such intensity. A Yorkshireman or Yorkshirewoman will tell you where they are from before they tell you anything else. It is not simply a county, it is a community, a culture, a badge of honour. This pride was not invented in modern times, it was forged across centuries of struggle and triumph. It is the pride of a land that has faced conquest by Romans, Vikings and Normans, yet never lost its spirit. It is the pride of a county that has produced saints and scholars, rebels and reformers, kings and cricketers. It is the pride of those who know that whatever hardship comes, Yorkshire will endure, because it always has. This identity has always been tied to the land itself. The moors, with their heather stretching to the horizon, speak of solitude and endurance. The dales, with their stone walls and winding rivers, speak of labour and community. The coast, from the white cliffs of Flamborough to the fishing harbours of Whitby and Scarborough, speaks of danger and opportunity. The land is not gentle, it is demanding, and it has shaped those who live upon it. To walk the Pennine Hills or the North York moors is to feel the same wind that lashed Viking sails, the same rain that soaked Roman soldiers, the same soil that miners and farmers have wrestled with for centuries. This bond between land and people is at the heart of Yorkshire's identity. The county is not just a place on a map, it is a landscape that lives in the hearts of its people. Yet Yorkshire's pride is not only inward-looking. Its legacy reaches far beyond its borders. The wool of Leeds and Bradford clothed the world. The steel of Sheffield built railways, ships and bridges across continents. The coal of Barnsley and Wakefield powered the engines of empire. The writers of Yorkshire, Emily and Charlotte Bronte, Ted Hughes, Alan Bennett, gave voice to human experience in ways that transcended place, yet were always rooted in the county's soil. The sportsmen of Yorkshire, from cricketers to footballers, carried its name onto national and international stages. Even the food, humble Yorkshire pudding, Wensleydale cheese, rhubarb from the famous Triangle, became part of the wider world's image of England. Yorkshire's pride is local, but its impact has always been global. What then does it mean to be Yorkshire today? It means carrying a memory that is both heavy and proud, the ruins of abbeys, the scars of strikes, the names on war memorials. It means speaking with a voice that still carries echoes of Norse settlers and medieval farmers. It means living in a land that demands endurance but rewards it with beauty. It means being part of a community that values plain speaking, hard work, loyalty, and humour. It means knowing that while industries rise and fall, while empires come and go, Yorkshire remains. The county's pride is not nostalgia, it is identity. It is the knowledge that history has tested it time and again, and each time it has endured. The title God's Own County may be said with a wink, with humour, with exaggeration, but it is also said with truth. Yorkshire's legacy is not only its castles and cathedrals, its mills and mines, its landscapes and literature. It is its people, past and present, whose endurance has carried it through every trial. That is what makes it unique, what makes it proud, what makes it beloved. In every age, Yorkshire has been at the heart of Britain's story. In every age, it has given more than its share of sacrifice and contribution. In every age, it has forged a character that refuses to be broken. As the story of Yorkshire closes, it does not end, for history is not static and the county continues to change, yet the lessons of its past remain. The Ice Age hunters, the Roman legionaries, the Viking settlers, the Norman conquerors, the medieval monks, the Tudor rebels, the Civil War soldiers, the industrial workers, the soldiers of 2 world wars, all live on in the identity of today's Yorkshire. Their endurance is the foundation of the pride that still beats in the county's heart. Yorkshire is no mere relic of history. It is history alive, history lived, history carried forward. And so when its people call it God's Own County, they are not only boasting, they are remembering. They are remembering the battles fought, the fields ploughed, the mines dug, the steel forged, the words written, the games played, the puddings baked, the lives lived. They are remembering a legacy that belongs to them and to all who claim Yorkshire as home. They are remembering that through all things, through war and peace, through ruin and renewal, Yorkshire has endured, and they are declaring, with the same pride that has carried the county through centuries, this is Yorkshire, scarred but unbroken, proud and enduring, forever God's own county.